Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith, and I'm your host, and it is Sunday, and if you're in California, yesterday was really hot. I'm sure that every podcast, every news station, everywhere are going to talk about it, so I will too. It was ridiculous yesterday, Saturday, August 15th. Hit like 112 in Sacramento, which is just bonkers. It's not quite a record. I definitely have seen it get up above that at some point in my time here. I've grown up here, so yeah, crazy. It's like the surface of the sun. Seen those memes. We usually get like 1 or 2 weeks out of the summer where it is just unbearable, but usually... Well, okay, maybe not unbearable. This is almost unbearable. The weird thing is we've had this, like, pressure system that's holding the heat in. So I got back to my house last night at, like, 9:30, and the thermostat was set to 80, and my air conditioning kicked on at 9:30 at night. So needless to say, when I walked outside this morning and expected it to be, like, 70 some odd and cool, it was not. So the air is just kind of in this like weird convection oven baloney thing, and it's supposed to be this hot all week. Apparently it got up into the high 80s in Oregon as well. So yeah, just like a weird series of events, to say the least, is going down weather-wise. So yeah, sorry to take up a bunch of time talking about that, but couldn't help myself, couldn't help but mention it. So, yeah, everybody stay safe out there. Make sure you're drinking lots of water. Be cool, you know. If you're in the Bay Area, consider buying lots of fans or some swamp coolers or something, because it's gonna be a long week, to say the least. Let's just put it that way. But anyway, on a less weather-oriented note, today is Sunday, and we all know what that means. It means that we are talking about Hyperion. Yay! Or at least I hope everybody's saying yay. I hope by now you know that if you tune in on Sundays, you're going to be hearing about the next part of the Hyperion novel series. We are in the third book, Endymion, which, it's just titled Endymion. Goes Hyperion, Fall of Hyperion, Endymion, Rise of Endymion. So I guess it makes sense, kind of the way that those things exist. And these books kind of do exist in pairs. So we, at this point, are waiting on like a very key and pivotal moment in the novel before we can move forward narratively, which I like the way that Simmons writes in that regard. It's almost like watching like a Quentin Tarantino movie where we know that we're working towards like this one interaction in some capacity. In a Tarantino movie, that interaction's already highlighted for or known by the audience, so we're just watching how we got there. But in Hyperion, we are kind of like watching how we get there, but in that same like multiplicitous form that Tarantino does in his films, because we've got a rotating cast of characters. In the first two Hyperion novels, we had like 4 or 5, sometimes even at points in time 6 different like simultaneous narrators, not simultaneous, but narrators going on at simultaneous points in the story. So as far as time is concerned, like temporally within the story, 4 or 5 different people are talking about the same thing from like different points of view or different points in space. So very interesting storytelling technique that Simmons is still doing in this novel, though in a much more limited fashion. It seems that as of right now, our 2 primary narrators are going to be DeSoya and that's Father Captain Federico DeSoya. It's funny the way that this universe does titles. It's almost like they just kind of stack them on top of each other. Because Father, as in he's a priest, Captain, as in he's in the military, and then DeSoya, not sure if that's his last name or if it's supposed to be like of this place. Hasn't really been clarified for me just yet. So as soon as I know, you will. But aside from DeSoya, we have Endymion, who is a Hyperion native. DeSoya is a priest / military guy from the New Vatican. As we know from last week, the New Vatican is being headed up by Lenar Hoyt. The narrative bit, or the piece of story that we're kind of waiting on, the 2 things that these gentlemen are both trying to, or the same thing that these gentlemen are both trying to accomplish in different ways, is that they want to, the phrasing of this is going to sound very poor, and I did not do it intentionally, but they are both looking to capture / rescue a little girl. Well, they don't really know how old she's going to be when she steps out of the time tomb, but if we remember correctly from last week, and the first week, the daughter of Lamia, who is known as Aeneia, is scheduled to leave the time tomb of the Sphinx, which has been one of the most important the most important time tombs on Hyperion. She's scheduled to leave the Sphinx exactly 256 years and some odd hours and days and what have you after she entered it. And somehow Lenar Hoyt knows this, or Father Hoyt knows this information, who he is now Pope Julius, as well as Martin Silenus knows this information. How the both of them know this information has not been revealed to us in any capacity just yet. But we do know that Lamia's daughter, Aeneia, is a special and very important figure within the overall prophecy / meta-narrative of these 4 books. She is supposed to be the one who teaches. At least that's what she is called as far as... that's what they call her when they're talking about her being born, and they're talking about the prophecy that pertains to her life, is she's known as the one who teaches. So there are lots of interest there, or at least lots of interesting potential there, because we don't know what these prophecies are, but apparently there's a bunch of them. And when she leaves the portal, which she does in this particular set of readings, don't worry, we'll get there, the Endymion refers to her as our Messiah. So I'm guessing that she has something to do with saving the human race back when it occurred, when the Pilgrims were the ones who were supposed to be responsible for doing it. So I think that Endymion and the Rise of Endymion, if I had to guess, are probably going to have a lot of oh, hey, by the way, all those things that were happening in the first 2 books, this is how they happened, and it's because of time travel shenanigans or something like that. Which I wouldn't be super thrilled by, honestly, if that's what I find out this book is about. I might not read the 4th one. Part of what made the first 2 so good was that there was this weird mixture of happenstantial and predestined things that occurred that seemed to create this odd balance between the ideas of determinism and free will. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see what the results of all that are. Not sure how I feel about it just yet, but who knows? Hopefully we'll get there. But regardless of that, hopefully we'll get there in the book, not me talking about it. Because if it happens, we'll talk about it. But regardless of that, Aeneas is very important to Martin Silenus because she is his goddaughter, I guess, or he's her guardian because Bronlamia died when Aeneas was 12. So Aeneas went into the Sphinx when she was 12 and has exited at some age that has not been stated just yet, though she is supposed to be like a very young girl, which I find to be interesting because the primary crux of the Endymion story in Greek mythology is that Endymion was the love interest of the Titaness of the moon. And so when the Titaness of the moon puts him to sleep forever, she still sires 8 of his sires. No, I think that's the male term. Mothers. Gives birth to 8 of his 8 kids with him, which is, weird. That's like Sleeping Beauty-esque level creepy. If you know the original Sleeping Beauty story, you know what I'm talking about. But, so if you know the Disney version, still kind of creepy. Guys, don't kiss women in their sleep. Women, don't kiss guys in their sleep. At least that's my opinion. Well, unless it's like something sweet. Anyway, segue here. Basically, the myth of Endymion is that shepherd, so beautiful that the moon, or the goddess / Titaness of the moon, this is Greek mythology, says, hey, I want to put that guy to sleep so that he's pretty forever. And I think Zeus is the one who acquiesces her request. I only know what that word means because of Pirates of the Caribbean. Thank you. Keira Knightley. She had that scene with Barbarossa. Anyway, though she's not the one that says it. Barbarossa is. Again, segues. Regardless, the fact that the story, the primary story that I believe is being referenced here, relies on there being a love interest and this girl is 12, to me says that, like, I don't think that there's going to be... I think that time is going to be pretty relative in this. She might be 12 now to start the story, and maybe she turns into, like, we do like a 10-year jump or something along those lines. Or they travel through space and she ages rapidly because she exists in some weird time pocket. Who knows? Or alternatively, she just doesn't fall in love with Endymion in any capacity, or doesn't find him to be, like, beautiful, and she just puts him to sleep because she loves him as, like, a parental figure, or he's going to die and he's refused the cruciform, so she puts him to sleep so that he doesn't have to die. Who knows? I would also guess that a lot of this book is going to have a ton to do with dreams, just because that has been one of Dan Simmons' primary themes for messages and symbols and things like that. I think that he does that to help enable the audience to feel like more connection to what's going on, because to just like throw a symbol out there and be like, oh yeah, this is that thing, and he saw it in his head, not necessarily as accessible as saying like, oh, he fell asleep and he was asleep and dreaming, and all of a sudden it's just better storytelling skills as far as that is concerned. So, back to the topic at hand. The narrative point that we're waiting for before the story can progress any further, because it seems pretty evident that it's not going to be on Hyperion the entire time. At least I hope not. I'm really hoping that we get to explore what the universe looks like after the hegemony has collapsed. I want to learn more about the involvement of the Pax, which is the military force that is involved or is intrinsically tied to the new church. I want to figure out more of the new church. I want to know what happened to Father DeRay. I want to know why Hoyt is crazy all of a sudden and wants everybody to have cruciforms. I want to know what happened to the Shrike. I have so many questions that I'm hoping this book will answer in some capacity. But we did finally get a number for Martin Silenus, and I guess he's literally 1,000 years old, which is awesome, and also awful. Who would want to live that long? I can't think of anybody. But Martin Silenus has chosen to actively. And I think that his big thing is that he wants to get to see old Earth again, because he specifically mentions it. But we'll get to that and everything that's happening. And what it's like when Ania finally gets there, and that will be right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
We're doing 7 commercial breaks today. That's a joke. We are not doing that. So I probably should start going back and listening to the episodes that come up, or the previous episode of the week, or at least taking notes of what I've talked about. But don't remember exactly what chapter we were on. I want to say we finished on chapter 10 or 9. So we're going through approximately chapter 10 or 11 through 15 this week, and a lot of interesting story stuff has happened. Not as much stuff that was interesting outside of like story, so philosophy wise and like symbolism wise and things like that. A little bit lighter this week, at least on the theory side of things, though there are like some asides and interesting questions that I think should be raised based off of like the reading this particular week, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So when we left off last week, I think it had just been revealed to us that Martin Silenus had in fact been able to keep or find or acquire the Hawking mat that the consul flew on in the original Hyperion novels. The original Hyperion books, or at least the Fall of Hyperion. He flew on the Hawking mat, which is basically just a magic carpet with like a very specific engine in it. The story behind the Hawking mat is that a guy made it as a gift for a woman, and that woman spurned him, and he finished it for the sake of finishing it, and then killed himself, I believe, or died of a broken heart, or something along those lines. So the Hawking mat is a very like storied and historical part of not only our understanding of the novel, but of Endymion's life. Endymion is a member of, they call them clans, but I can't really say he's a clansman. Whole different set of implications. But he is a member of a clan on Hyperion, a clan of natives, I believe, who believe that everything that Martin Silenus's Cantos wrote about was like true and actually happened, because it did, or at least according to the thing that we read, it did. In our understanding of the universe, those things actually happened. So when he sees the Hawking mat, it's a substantial occasion, I guess, for him. And what we find out is that the Hawking mat is the thing that is going to allow him to fly in and save the day for Ania, because there are these highly trained troops, so highly trained, in fact, that they could like take out a space battalion while they were on the ground. I don't know. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me, because the like scale of force in this novel is very reliant on all of the things in the novel. Like a lot of the weaponry and stuff is so science fiction-y that like we just kind of have to gloss over it as being part of the universe and not make any assumptions that it's going to like I don't know, be, I guess, scientifically accurate. It seems like a lot of things are kind of not scientifically accurate in this novel, which is part of the reason why it makes good such science fiction, in my opinion. If you spend too much time trying to explain how something works, then you have not solicited enough buy-in from the reader. In my opinion, you should be able to tell such a good story that the reader is like, okay, yeah, I guess it works, that's fine. Especially when it comes to science fiction or fantasy, even. It's kind of like in an action movie, you know. We're watching Vin Diesel jump off of the Forest Lake Bridge and parachute down, and, like, you know, we are so engrossed in whatever story is being told that we don't think about the fact that that's just kind of ridiculous. Why would you do that? Why would you ditch the car and blah, blah, blah? And I don't even think he ends up getting away. It is what it is. Regardless, it was kind of silly. And I can appreciate that. But also at the same time, when I was watching the movie, wasn't questioning it. And that's kind of how a good storyteller tells a story, especially in science fiction, in my opinion. Because if you have to spend too much time explaining something, then, again, I just don't think that you did a very good job of telling a good story, I guess would be the best way to phrase that. So, the next chapter immediately following that is DeSoya's kind of explanation of the preparations that are being undertaken in order to capture Ania alive and take her back to the what is the world called? It might be Pacham. I can't remember if they're still on Pacham or not. Pacham, if you remember from the first two books, is the place where the Catholics have gone and established their new Vatican. When old Earth was consumed by a black hole, they were able to, or before it was consumed, they were able to take, like, all of the components of, like, the original Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica and all that. They, like, took it apart piece by piece and then reassembled it faithfully to the original. I know I said there's not a ton of philosophy involved in these particular chapters, but we've talked about the idea of Theseus's ship on here before. Wonder if you add in the variable of I took that ship out of its original harbor and just transported it in that same fashion and put it in a new harbor. Is it the same thing? I think that a lot of what Simmons is trying to say is that things kind of exist as, like, in some sort of, like, cycle or some sort of perpetuous thing where it's like all of these elements are kind of combining in some sort of chaotic fashion to create this thing or idea of a thing that perpetuates itself into the future. But not totally sure exactly how it is that he wants to handle that particular thing, I guess. I don't really know. So there's a new character who's introduced to us. It's a female commander whose name is escaping me right now, who is not that important, even though I thought she would be, but we'll get to that. And then there's another gentleman who's introduced to us, whose name I also forget, but he's like a very large black man is the way that he's described in the book. So I think that it's the first time that we see a person of color explicitly mentioned in these novels. So I'm wondering if we're gonna, like, kind of figure out or hear about where he's from, perhaps, or like where how Simmons is going to handle that type of diversity within this universe, which I am interested in hearing about. It seemed like he kind of mentioned lightly that there were a lot of different types of still human being people within, like, the ouster colonies, because the ousters practiced a lot of, like, genetic modifications and things like that the traditional hegemony did not, and that the traditional hegemony even, like, outlawed, I think, in some capacity, though I'm not entirely sure. It's never mentioned explicitly. You know, on that note of the hegemony and what was allowed and not allowed in there, I am really interested to hear exactly what happened with Maynard Gladstone. after the fall of the hegemony. If I had to guess, we're going to run into her. I have a feeling that she'll somehow still be around, either via like recording or memory or flashback or something. Yeah, it doesn't seem to me like we've heard the end of her story. And as I've mentioned before, I have a theory that Endymion is the consul's son. So if he is indeed the consul's son, then I cannot imagine us not interacting with the with Maina Gladstone, because Maina Gladstone was a pretty important part of the character development of the consul, in my opinion. So I would wager to guess that she will be in here, but that's not necessarily super important right at this moment. Just kind of a little rabbit trail. So DeSoya is getting ready for Ania to arrive. And as he's getting ready for Ania to arrive, there's a ship that appears on the horizon, or at least there's a bogey that appears on the horizon. And we kind of start to learn a little bit about DeSoya. I think a lot of these last few chapters were to like move the narrative forward, but that wasn't their primary function. I think their primary function was to teach us about the type of people that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of this book. Because DeSoya is not as he would seem, would be the best way to phrase it. He seems very concerned with like the way in which Ania is going to be welcomed, the way in which she's going to be handled as a, I don't know, prisoner of war. Though there isn't really a war going on. Yeah, I don't know exactly how to phrase what it is that Hoyt intends to do with Ania. I don't think that there's supposed to be any sort of like weird pervertedness to the fact that Ania is like a 12-year-old girl and Lenore Hoyt wants to capture her and imprison her. I think it's just supposed to be that he's looking to indoctrinate her into Catholicism / Christianity, because there's some belief that she's going to like topple their religious dominance that they've experienced in the last like couple hundred years. Specifically in the last 100 years, because of the presence of the cruciforms. I think that it's really important to the Catholic Church to not allow Ania to be free, because if Ania is free, I guess it's prophesied that she will like start converting people away from Catholicism or Christianity. If I had to guess, I think that she can remove cruciforms, I think is going to be kind of her thing. So, like, she's going to convince people to allow her to remove their cruciform, because the cruciform is ultimately a tool of the Technocore, and the Technocore, as we know from the last books, is, like, the most evil thing in the universe. Well, evil. It's the most, I guess, antithetical to the current human existence thing in the universe. It's hard to call them evil because it's not like they're really that much worse than anybody else. I also don't necessarily think that good and evil exist in a relevant capacity, especially in terms of this book. But regardless of that, they're kind of like the antagonists, if you will, of the Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion novels, because they're the ones who are making it seem as if there's going to be a war between the Ousters and the Hegemony, but really the Ousters were only interested in Hyperion, and so when the Hegemony is attacked by Ouster ships, quote-unquote, turns out that those are actually the Technocore, and so the Technocore becomes this, like, you know, gonna exterminate the entire human race type of force, which ultimately, I guess, would be evil in this context. Though, at the end of the first book of Hyperion, the one that's just titled Hyperion, I get the sense that Dan Simmons doesn't necessarily think that it would be the worst thing in the world for all of humanity to just suddenly vanish out of the galaxy. So, I think that there's kind of like a very balanced approach that's being taken here. But, anyway, all that to say, Hoyt wants to capture Ania as soon as she exits the time tune of the Sphinx and have her put under the sedative, and then have a cruciform forcibly implanted on her, and then she's going to get in a space, or be put into a spaceship, die, and then be resurrected thanks to the cruciform 3 days later. As we remember, the cruciform resurrects things 3 days later. So I'm wondering if the Technocore designed it that way, or if maybe there's something more to the Jesus narrative that Dan Simmons is going to try to toss in here. Who knows? Anyway, we will continue talking about what happened in the book in the next few chapters right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Things that are important in Endymion. So, right before the break, I was just kind of talking about the type of person that DeSoya is. It seems interesting to me that it's been made pretty clear to him that this girl, Ania, is going to live not a great life on Pacham, but he still is blindly following the faith that he has in the Catholic system of this particular universe, because reasons. I'm sure that we will learn why he's so devoted to the church at some point. I'm not entirely sure if it's super relevant. That's not true. Why did I say that? Of course it's relevant. I'm hoping that we will get to at some point. I don't know how relevant I guess it will be to the overall narrative of the story. I think that depends on how Simmons decides to tie everything in to this particular novel. But that's, that's kind of, that is what it is, I guess. So, DeSoya is kind of expressing some sort of desire to display a humanistic kindness to Ania as soon as she lands, because he is just kind of saddened by the fact that she's not really going to get to do much other than be in captivity, which is just kind of cruddy, if you ask me. And we should not be a big fan of that. I already didn't really like Hoyt from the very beginning of the Hyperion novels, and I like him even less now. I don't know what Simmons' intention was with that character or with the books overall when he first wrote him, if he was going to write all 4 books, if he knew where Hoyt was going to go by the end of it. If he did a great job planning it. If he did not, then he did a great job improvising with it, because again, I didn't like Hoyt from the beginning, and here he is, this oppressive, manipulative, magnanimous figure who is leading the Catholic Church, and he wants to kidnap a 12-year-old girl and basically forcibly indoctrinate. Doesn't indoctrination imply that it's being forced on you? Not totally sure. Forcibly indoctrinate this 12-year-old girl so that she won't convert people away from Catholicism or Christianity. But I don't know. That's it's just bad. Something that is mentioned Well, we'll get to that later. So now we're going to go back to Endymion and where he is at in this particular portion of the story. So Endymion is back at, I guess he's still at Silenus' house. Apparently we don't get a little training montage of him on the hawking mat, which I think would be, what is it, hawking mat? I think it's hawking mat. I'm not totally sure. Just realized Stephen Hawking is a physicist, and they call them the Hawking drives, so I wonder if there's any relation there. I would have to guess so. Simmons seems to like to reference individuals of scientific clout in this novel. I don't know. It's kind of like historical nonfiction, but in the future, is how I would phrase the writing style of this in general, which is super cool, but also just a little weird in some capacities. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it completely. I have really enjoyed it. But there are certain things where it's like, oh, that's kind of campy that you're referencing this thing that happened, either happened in the future from when he wrote the book or happened in the past from when he wrote the book, or these figures that were familiar. But I guess it is supposed to be like accurate to within like 500 years of our current experience of time. So it is definitely interesting the way that Simmons is portraying those things. So anyway, back to the hawking mat. We don't get a little training montage of Endymion getting used to it, but we do find out that Martin Silenus has this intricate plan that is going to make it so Endymion doesn't have to face off against the Swiss Guard, who, again, are those like super soldiers that were trained so well that they can take out like an entire battalion themselves. They're supposed to be like the most powerful the most powerful military force in the universe. And so Silenus has a plan that is programmed into the hawking mat, and that plan is for Endymion to fly that hawking mat through the labyrinth. Now, if you remember, Hyperion is a labyrinth world. There are 9 labyrinthian worlds, and each one of those worlds is Earth-like in some capacity. Most of them are kind of like Mars, is the way that Simmons describes it, where they're like kind of underdeveloped as far as vegetation is concerned, but like tectonically, presence of water, things like that, very similar to in design to Earth. And apparently, the labyrinths of most of the other worlds have been mapped. Never any mention of that. But Silenus mapped a portion of the particular, or of the labyrinth on Hyperion 200 years prior to when Aeneas is supposed to exit the Sphinx for this very purpose, to go get her from to get her from the Sphinx time tomb without being detected. If I had to guess, there's some sort of conflict that occurs between Hoyt and Silenus. If I'm a gambling man, I think Hoyt had Braun killed, or had something to do with Braun death in some capacity, because he wanted to be able to acquire guardianship, or possession is the wrong word to use, but he wanted to be able to make it so that he was the one who was going to raise Aeneas, or be the one that Aeneas grew up with. And I think Silenus kind of gets in the way of that. And so they both are able to figure out simultaneously when it is that she'll return. And Silenus knows that he's going to have to figure out some scrappy, creative way to rescue her and be sure of her safety. And so I think his way of doing that is by going and flying this hawking mat all the way through all of the labyrinth until he can map out a course for the autopilot on this map or mat to the Sphinx from, like, I don't remember exactly where it is that Endymion enters, but he's able to enter in a place where he's not detected, or he's the bogey. I'm just realizing this. He's the bogey that the Swiss guards see, and they dispatch themselves to go take care of. And instead of him getting blown up by the orbital Lance missile that gets launched at him, he is able to fly down into the entrance of the labyrinth. Though I'm not totally sure, because the ship is also present somewhere in this story that's supposed to be, and there's supposed to be like a distraction of some kind that Silenus is creating so that Endymion doesn't get captured, but there's no mention of that in Endymion's narrative. It's just kind of casually mentioned that that Silenus is going to have a distraction in general, not specifically mentioned what that distraction will be necessarily. So, maybe we'll figure out what that was. Not totally sure. But before he leaves, Silenus says a couple interesting things. He recites this poem to Endymion that I didn't really get it completely. It sounded kind of like the pathway to true salvation doesn't have anything to do with spirituality. It has everything to do with presence in the world and in reality around you, because it kind of just says, if you see all these things, then you are going to be saved and you'll have enlightenment and eternal life. So even if you die, you won't really be dead. So kind of interesting. If I had to guess, that probably is a little bit of Simmons trying to, I guess, tell us about his own spiritual views or his own religious views in some capacities. Not entirely sure if that's the point of it, or if it's just Silenus trying to give some sort of cryptic message to Endymion. But regardless of that, Endymion kind of hears it and doesn't really care, and then we find out that Silenus believes that Aeneas has been on Old Earth this entire time, or was on Old Earth for a brief period of time and then traveled back to this period in time 256 years later. So she just kind of jumped ahead, but really didn't spend that long on Old Earth. And if we remember correctly, the last place that we saw the Shrike prior to its battle with Cassad was Old Earth, where it was messing with Emily Hunt and John Severin, who is the second Keats persona. So if we kind of think back, that means that in some capacities, the Shrike is probably involved with whatever it is that Rachel is doing, which, it kind of does and doesn't make sense. Again, the Shrike is this weird thing where, because it exists outside of time, even though Cassad is supposedly able to defeat it, that's one iteration of it, and it can exist in multiple iterations or capacities at any given point in time because it exists in all time, so it's got this quasi-absoluteness to it. But I'm not entirely sure. The deistic aspects of the Shrike get kind of manipulated a little bit by Simmons into it kind of just becoming a glorified weapon of sorts. It's a representative of the AI's supreme intelligence, or the AI god. But if the AIs are completely destroyed, then there ought not to be anything to perpetuate the existence of the AI god. Though I will say, again, if the AI god exists in the same capacity that, the other god that Simmons says existed, then that means if it existed at any point, then it exists at all points, because it would be able to exist at all points if it can exist at any point, and therefore it would never stop existing. If the Shrike falls under that, it's the same thing, but that would mean that in some capacity the techno core is probably the same way. I'm not really sure. I'd have to, like, interview Dan Simmons, which I would totally be down to do. So, you know, like, trend it on Twitter. Hashtag let Keith interview Dan Simmons. GSMC Dan Simmons. I don't know. It's not going to happen. No way in a million years. But that's okay. Hopefully someday I'll interview somebody who has done something really cool, and I can learn from them. Regardless, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll get to the part where Ania actually shows up. And then we can finally start talking about things aside from Ania and her showing up and Martin Silenus, and maybe we can get some more interesting philosophical content or something. So we'll be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Alrighty, everybody, we're back. Thanks for sticking around. I feel like I say that every week, and I tell myself I'm not going to say it next week, or I'm not going to say it this week as I'm talking, but, you know, I'm just glad that you're still here. You could have left. I mean, you'd miss out on the last 15 minutes of the podcast, and that would be lame, but I would understand. I suppose it would be somewhat acceptable behavior. Not very acceptable, but somewhat acceptable. Regardless of all that. Right before the break, we were kind of discussing some, I guess, important-ish things about the novel. They were important. We were talking about how it was that Endymion was going to get to the time tomb of the Sphinx, get around the Swiss Guard, rescue Ania, and take her back to safety so that she could travel out into space to go do something or another, and then come back and say goodbye to Silenus before he dies. I don't know exactly, like, how it is that they intend to do the things that they're going to do. I guess what's his face? Endymion is supposed to take her straight to the Ousters. So that's a thing, which I'm super looking forward to. Oh, yeah, I guess if I'm implying that she ends up going with Endymion to meet the Ousters, that implies what happened in the... Anyway, okay, so finally we get to Endymion in the labyrinth. He's freaking out. He has to, like, legitimately set the hawking mat down on the ground, get out, and scream just so that he can, like, hear himself, because the containment field on the hawking mat doesn't allow for air to flow through, and the labyrinth is completely pitch black, as in there is no light in it whatsoever. So he eventually decides to, like, turn on a flashlight, which turns out to be a bad idea, because the hawking mat is just, like, floating through these square tunnels that he, like, barely fits through. It really kind of gives you some admiration for what Silenus had to go through in order to map this place. Definitely made me appreciate Silenus a little bit more, if I'm being honest. Especially considering Silenus would have been like 800 years old when he did that, because it was 200 years previous. So he wouldn't have been like 800 biological years old, because he's slept so many times in like chronostasis is what it's called. Which is what Walt Disney is in right now. Just kidding. That's not true. Conspiracy theory. Just a joke, guys. Don't at me in the comments. But it gives me a lot of respect for Silenus for, like, deciding to do that, I guess. So Silenus mapped it, programmed it into the hawking mat. Endymion just basically says, hey, autopilot, do your thing. Sits back and freaks out as he flies through the labyrinth towards the Sphinx time tomb, where Ania is scheduled to show up in like T-minus a few hours. And then we get the chapter like leading up to Ania showing up from DeSoya's point of view, where there's a few interactions here and there between DeSoya and a couple of his commanding officers who are relatively important. Well, one of them is very important. The other one, she dies. So let's just put it that way. We get this like very meaningful description of her, and you're like, oh, cool, an interesting new character who is now dead. Which I am curious how dead everybody is going to be in this novel, because there's so many people with cruciforms running around, so who knows who's actually dead and who's dead and will come back to life and all of that good stuff. But there's something that, as Endymion goes through the labyrinth and as he gets to the entrance of the labyrinth, he mentions that he flies over the plateau where Lenar, Hoyt, as well as Father Duray both met with the Pecora. And he also mentions that the Pax and the church harvested all of the cruciforms that were there. If I had to guess, they harvested the cruciforms that were in the labyrinth that... Who was down there that saw that? I want to say it was Weintraub was down in the labyrinth, and he's the one who saw all of the... No, it was Duray. Duray was down there. I remember that because it was one of the first new things that Duray got to do. He's the one who delivers the message to Keats, who then delivers it to Gladstone that the Technocore is saying that people can hide on the labyrinthian worlds, but they really can't, and that the intent was to just implant people with a bunch of cruciforms and then blow up the human race to force them all to have to be like constantly reincarnated, revived, regenerated. We'll go with that. Constantly regenerated until the point where they were basically useless and impotent, and so that the Technocore could like enslave them. So super fun stuff. But he mentions that they've harvested all those, which to me says that cruciforms are a limited resource in some capacity, which I am curious how many there are. Wouldn't be surprised if it was like some number related to a different religious sect, like if he wanted to go like Jehovah's Witness, which I think, and if you are a Jehovah's Witness, I apologize if I get the number wrong. I think it's like 700 and some odd thousand people are the ones who are going to be saved, or 200 and some odd thousand. That might also be the Seventh-day Adventists. I'm not entirely sure which sect of religion believes in that specific number, but there is a sect of religious beliefs that are related to the Judeo-Christian set of beliefs that says that there will only be like some odd 100,000 or some 100,000 people saved. So I think that that's interesting. Wouldn't be surprised to see that the cruciforms were a limited resource that cannot be reproduced. And if they can be, I'm curious how they do that. Wouldn't be surprised if that might be some knowledge that Ania has. So we'll see. Regardless, lots of preparations are happening. DeSoya is walking up to the entrance of the Sphinx Time Tomb and has a welcoming committee for Ania, which is not all that welcoming. It's basically a bunch of armed guards with full combat armor on and like ridiculous amount of weaponry training. So just like these huge individuals who are all armed to the teeth. And then someone with a cruciform in stasis, and then someone with, a sedative gun. Funny they call it a gun. It's almost like seriously, everything to meet this girl is not welcoming. And DeSoya wants to make a point to let this girl see his eyes. So even though they're in the middle of a sandstorm, which has been whipping up due to the entropic fields, which happen in the Hyperion books, the first two, all the time. So even though the idea is that he's supposed to just like capture her and not let her speak, not speak to her, not say anything. He's supposed to just like grab her, put her under, and go. He decides that he wants her to get to see his face. This is what I was talking about before, when DeSoya kind of seems like he has a little bit more going on than what might be just like right in front of us. it seems like he actually has a heart in some capacity, even though, if I had to, it seems like he's pretty easily ordered around by the religious group that he's affiliated with as well. So I definitely am interested to see how that particular set of beliefs changes and evolves throughout the story, because as soon as Ania does come out of the portal, which she's the first person to come out of the portal, I think, since the portal began existing, there's only ever been people who have been able to go into the portal at the Sphinx. No one has ever returned from it. So the fact that she's returning from it is a pretty big deal. So she returns from the portal in the Sphinx, supposedly that leads to Old Earth, so she's returning from Old Earth in some capacity. And apparently the Sphinx chooses people, which would make sense why Hunt wasn't able to return, because he found that portal in the middle of the Colosseum, if you will remember correctly. He found the portal in the middle of the Colosseum that he thought he could walk through, but he couldn't walk through it. And he, originally in the books, we probably thought like, oh, it's because it's a Farcaster and the Farcaster network is down, but it's actually because I think there's some sort of like extra, or what would the word be I'm looking for? Extraterrestrial? No. Like some extra human power? I don't know. I don't know why I can't think of it. Holy power. I don't know. Like it's a God thing. This is basically the way that I think that Simmons would probably try to phrase it, but he'll say it in a much more scientific and fun way. Because he's telling a better story, because he wrote the story. I'm just telling the story about his story. Regardless, Desoya is just outside of the portal, and Ania leaves the portal, and she says it's going to be okay, after he calls out to her, and he all of a sudden like feels super at peace, and then the Shrike appears, and everything goes to crap. Pretty much all of the Swiss Guard are murdered, which I don't know how dead they actually are, because most of them supposedly have cruciforms, but I would not be surprised if they're actually dead, because the Shrike removed the cruciform from them, because we know that the Shrike is the only thing capable of doing that, at least to our knowledge, because the Shrike did it for Duray. So when Duray gets revived, the Shrike removes his cruciform and leaves Hoyt's cruciform. So we know that the Shrike is capable of removing the cruciform, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Shrike removed the cruciform on every person that it killed. It even goes into space and kills a bunch of the people that are in the spaceships orbiting Hyperion. So I think Hoyt, in some capacity, or Julius, Father Julius, Father Julius, or the Pope Benedictus Julius the Seventh or whatever. I think he was somewhat aware of the fact that the Shrike might appear, and thought maybe if he armed enough people and put enough highly trained people there that they might be able to handle it. But the problem is that the Shrike travels through time pretty much, so, or at least it causes fluctuations in time. So the perception was that there were thousands of Shrikes attacking everywhere at the same time, in like at such speed that it was ridiculous, or like too fast for anything. So in the confusion of the Shrike's attack, the highly trained soldiers end up actually shooting each other a bunch, which to me indicates that they weren't really maybe as highly trained as we thought they were. And Endymion is able to sneak in and rescue Ania. So Ania is with Endymion. She gets on the hawking mat. Everybody on the side of the Vatican sustains some pretty heavy injuries, especially Desoya, who pretty much completely loses his left leg. But Ania and Endymion end up on the consul's old ship with Abetic, and the ship takes off and flies out into space, and we get to a chapter where Desoya is narrating, or someone's observing Desoya and narrating, regardless. Desoya is narrating and finds out that the ship is actually, they can see it on their radar, and then we find out that Desoya is going to just kind of like play cat and mouse with the ship, probably for the rest of the book, I would imagine. But whenever the ship that Desoya is on goes into, like, I don't know, hyperspace travel, he dies. And so he has to get resurrected. I don't know exactly how that system works. It hasn't been fully explained to me. So he's not really worried about his leg, because when he gets revived, it'll come back apparently. So, yeah, that is where we are at. So I know that we kind of like wrapped it up real quickly there. We'll talk about this more next week. Definitely looking forward to the next few things that this book has in store. Glad to finally be past this particular narrative point. So we'll see how things go from here. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you're in California or on the West Coast, make sure that you're drinking lots of fluids, staying inside as much as possible. That sun is intense. I do not envy anybody who has to be outside in it over the next few days. It's not going to be healthy. Hope everybody who's experiencing any kind of adverse weather, I know that we're not the only ones in California right now who are experiencing adverse weather. I hope you all are staying safe. I know that this year has been really rough. We're closer to it being done than we were, or than it is happening, I guess. So there's less of the year left than there was of the year. So, hopefully things will turn around at some point in the near future. So keep your head up. Stay safe out there. Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter. Don't think we have an Instagram or LinkedIn. Just check for us on social media, GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. So thanks again for tuning in, everybody, and have a great week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.